The Fortune of Beverly Hills. The afternoon sun was casting long, golden shadows across the rolling hills where the grass grew tall and wild. In this secluded corner of the country, far away from the bustling sounds of modern cities, lived a man named Jed. Jed was a quiet soul, a mountaineer who knew the language of the woods and the patterns of the stars better than he knew the ways of the changing world. He was a man of simple pleasures and deep integrity, though his pockets were often empty. For many years, Jed had struggled with a quiet, stubborn dignity to keep his family fed. He spent his days wandering the rugged terrain, looking for whatever nature might provide, never complaining about the hardships that the seasons brought. Then, on a day that seemed no different from any other, everything changed with the suddenness of a lightning strike. Jed was out in the deep woods, squinting through the sunlight as he took aim at some wild game to bring home for the evening meal. He pulled the trigger, but his shot missed the target and struck the rocky ground instead. What happened next was something no one in the hills could have ever predicted. Where the bullet had pierced the earth, a strange, dark liquid began to bubble up through the soil. It did not stop. It flowed faster and thicker, a rich, dark stream pouring out of the heart of the ground. Oil, that is. To the folks in the valley, it was known as black gold or Texas tea. In a single moment of accidental fortune, Jed was no longer a poor mountaineer struggling to survive. He was a millionaire. The news traveled through the hills like wildfire, reaching every cabin and clearing. The kinfolk gathered around Jed, their eyes wide with wonder as they looked at the bubbling wealth. They told him that his days in the hills were over. They said that a man with that kind of fortune belonged in a place where the sun always shone on grand houses and paved roads. California was the place he ought to be, they insisted. Jed, who had never desired luxury but cared deeply for the happiness of his family, listened to their advice. With a mixture of excitement and hesitation, the family loaded up their old, trusty truck with everything they owned, from wooden chairs to iron pots. They said goodbye to the quiet valleys and moved toward a destination that sounded like a dream. Beverly Hills, that is. A land of shimmering swimming pools, flashing movie stars, and grand estates that stretched as far as the eye could see. They were the Beverly Hillbillies, starting a completely new chapter in a world they had never known. The transition to city life was filled with small wonders and daily confusions. Early one morning, while the stars were still bright in the California sky, a loud, cheerful voice echoed through the grand halls of their new home. Granny was up, stamping her feet and making a grand commotion. She shouted out to the rest of the house, asking what all the racket was about and declaring that it was time to go to work, calling anyone still asleep a lazybones. From the depths of a comfortable bed, Jethro groaned, pulling the blanket over his head. He pointed out that it was only 5 o'clock in the morning, an hour when even the birds were still asleep. Granny did not care for his excuses. She snapped back that it was better late than never, her energy completely untouched by the early hour. Jethro slowly sat up, rubbing his eyes, and muttered that he was supposed to be a big city boy now, and nothing should be able to get him out of bed at such an hour. Granny simply smiled and asked if he wanted breakfast. The mention of food changed his mind instantly. Jethro leaped out of bed, declaring that he was ready. Granny chuckled, observing that for a city boy, he could move pretty good when his stomach was involved. She informed him that Uncle Jed was already sitting at the table, waiting for the morning meal. At the table, Annie Mae was yawning heavily, her eyes half closed as she greeted the morning. Granny looked at her with a stern but loving eye, telling the young ones that they would not have this trouble if they went to bed at a decent hour. Annie Mae protested weakly, saying she had gone to bed at 9 o'clock the previous night. Granny ignored the complaint, handed over a rooster, and told her to put him outside before sitting down to eat. She announced that as soon as they finished breakfast, they would go down and get the Clampett Enterprises ready for business. Jethro looked at her with genuine confusion. He explained that the bank building would not even be open yet, because folks in Beverly Hills simply did not get up this early. Granny paused, surprised by this information, questioning if they really stayed in bed so long. Just then, a heavy knock sounded at the front door. Granny smiled triumphantly, and asked if they knew who was at the door. When Jethro asked who it could possibly be, Granny proudly announced that it was Mr. Drysdale, and he was going to ride into town with them. Jethro could hardly believe his ears, wondering why a wealthy banker would be out at 5 o'clock in the morning. Granny explained that Mr. Drysdale had not stayed up half the night like the young ones had. He understood that the early morning was the best part of the day, believing that the early bird catches the worm. According to Granny, the banker was up, ready to go, bright-eyed and bushy-tailed. When the door opened, Mr. Drysdale stumbled into the room, looking completely dazed and disoriented. He looked around the brightly lit room, blinking heavily, and asked where he was and what had happened. Granny greeted him warmly, reminding him that he had called her earlier. She asked if there was any trouble. Mr. Drysdale, trying to find his bearings, stammered that there was no trouble at all. Granny nodded happily, explaining that they needed him to open up the bank building so they could all go to work. She pointed out the window, noting that the stars were still out and the moon was shining beautifully. She remarked that such a sight always made a person feel good, reciting an old saying that staying up at 5 ensured a person would thrive, while waiting till 6 would put them in a fix. She then looked out at the horizon and asked what kind of a day it was going to be. Mr. Drysdale, shivering slightly in the early chill, muttered that it looked like it was going to be rotten. Granny, ever the practical woman, decided she had best go check the weather signs herself. Jed watched the banker with a warm, admiring smile. He exclaimed that Mr. Drysdale was the very first city fellow he had ever seen with enough gumption to get going before the sun was up. Mr. Drysdale, trying to sound confident and professional despite his exhaustion, repeated the old saying about thriving at 5 and being in a fix at 6, claiming it was a rule he always followed. Jed smiled warmly, declaring that they were kindred spirits. However, he disagreed with the banker's weather prediction, stating that his own country instincts told him it was going to be a fine day. Mr. Drysdale nodded weakly, glad for the optimism. Jed then asked if the banker had already eaten his breakfast. Granny, returning from her weather check, chimed in to say that she knew this man kept country hours and would surely want a warm meal. She offered him a fresh cup of coffee, which Mr. Drysdale accepted gratefully, saying he would love it. As Mr. Drysdale reached for the cup, Jed noticed something unusual and pointed out that the banker was still wearing his night clothes. Mr. Drysdale looked down at his pajamas, blushing with embarrassment. He quickly explained that he had left the house in such a hurry that he did not want to turn on the lights and risk waking his wife. Jed, misunderstanding the dynamics of the banker's household, chuckled and remarked that he reckoned Mr. Drysdale beat his wife up regularly in the mornings. Mr. Drysdale, startled by the phrase, clarified with a laugh that he meant he liked to get up ahead of her, not anything violent. He suggested they move along and have that coffee. Jed agreed warmly, telling him to go right ahead and that the family would be right with him. Mr. Drysdale thanked him and stepped out, grateful for the warmth of the hospitality. Later that morning, inside the grand walls of the bank, Jane Hathaway walked into the executive suite and stopped in her tracks. She looked at the clock, then at the figure sitting behind the desk. She called out his name, asking what he was doing there at only 8:30 in the morning. Mr. Drysdale looked up, his face lined with fatigue. He informed her that he had actually been at the office since 5:30 that morning. Jane was astonished and asked why he would arrive at such an hour. Mr. Drysdale explained that he had to open up the building so the Clampetts could go to work, adding that from now on, they wanted the doors open at 5 o'clock every single day. Jane looked closer at her boss and pointed out that he was wearing pajamas under his desk. Mr. Drysdale sighed, admitting he was so sleepy that he had completely forgotten to change into his normal clothes. Jane shook her head in disbelief, pointing out that he had a proper suit hanging in the closet and begging him to put it on immediately. She asked if he realized what people would think if they walked into the office and saw him dressed like that. Mr. Drysdale, too tired to care, asked what they could possibly think. Jane explained that people might think he had hired her for reasons other than her secretarial authority. Mr. Drysdale, letting out a dry chuckle, admitted that as a matter of fact, he did hire her for other reasons, namely that she worked cheap. Jane looked offended for a brief minute, but then smiled, reminding him that just for that comment, she had helped the Clampetts stay on the 5th floor for a whole year. She joked that she could easily arrange to get him up at 5 every morning. Mr. Drysdale shook his head, declaring that he was getting rid of the problem today by bringing in a hired gun, a professional troubleshooter. Jane looked intrigued and asked who this person was. Mr. Drysdale described him as the absolute best in the business, a man who is cunning, cruel, ruthless, unprincipled, and conniving. He called him a beautiful man for the job and mentioned that his name was Homer Bedloe. Right on cue, the office door opened, and a sharp-eyed man stepped into the room. Jane stood up and greeted him, using his name. Homer Bedloe stopped, looking suspicious, and asked how she could possibly know his name already. Jane smiled politely, explaining that he fit the description Mr. Drysdale had provided perfectly. Mr. Drysdale motioned for him to sit down. Homer looked at Jane coldly, asking if she and the banker were friends. He stated firmly that he did not have any friends himself. Turning to Mr. Drysdale, Homer expressed his hope that his work would be pleasing, mentioning that he would like to give up his current job on the railroad and stay at the bank permanently, as a bank offered wonderful opportunities for a man of his talents. Mr. Drysdale agreed warmly, listing the wonderful things a banker got to do, such as foreclosing on mortgages and repossessing cars and furniture. Homer smiled darkly, adding that it must be a great kick to go into a house and take away a television set just when the children were sitting down to watch their favorite show. As Homer spoke, he began to look around the office nervously, checking behind the curtains and under the chairs. Jane watched him with growing confusion and asked what he was looking for. Homer replied matter-of-factly that he was checking for snipers and movie traps. He explained that it was a force of habit, adding that a man did not get to be his age and remain mean by being careless. He turned his gaze back to the banker, confirming his identity as Milburn Drysdale. Mr. Drysdale nodded proudly, saying that was correct. Homer stared at him for a long moment and remarked that he would have known him anywhere because he was the spitting image of his father.